Walk with History today is from the Casemate Museum in Hampton, Virginia at Fort Monroe. A casemate, as you will see, is that arched brick way that holds artillery fort provisions. Building 17, we're right here. This is where the museum is, right here. It just gives you a part of the inside of the fort. The War of 1812, so apparent that America was vulnerable to attack, and Fort Monroe was an answer to that. In 1609, when this place was first looked at and thought, what a good location for a fort, this is the first answer to that. This is Fort Algernon, Old Point Comfort. So this is Old Point Comfort, this area where Fort Monroe was built. But this is what it first looked like. So this is what casemates look like, these rooms with these bricks all around. And this is awesome. This is what the officers' dining hall would have looked like. It's the Fort Monroe Club. It's a formal space for officers to eat and hang out. Again, everything is built into these casemates here. But this is where you would come and have a drink. This is the missing man table. If you don't know what that is, that's in lieu of prisoners of war. And the missing, there's everything on there has a symbolism of something to bring our prisoners of war home. So that's that table that's there, but this is what the bar would have looked like. And you get to see some of the original walls. Very cool. In the museum, they have some of the stained glass from the Chapel of the Centurion. And this chapel is significant not only as the chapel here at Fort Monroe, but President Eisenhower attended the wedding of his son at the Chapel of the Centurion here at Fort Monroe. So people lived inside the fort, and people could make it very homey. And as you can see, they have a piano here, they have fake walls here where you could hang pictures, there's sofas for sitting. But you can see bedrooms were made here. You had a nice view of the moat. And this is what it would look like if you were an officer and your family lived here with you at Fort Monroe. They made it look as homey as they could, these casemates. In 1869, these casemates were assigned to student officers. In 1871, became Fort Monroe's club. So the student officers and their wives stayed here. Here are some weapons they show here. This is the musket Springfield. And this is the Navy revolver. Famous Navy users included Wild Bill Hickok. That does not look like a very sturdy weapon to use or accurate. And here's a rifle musket. Look at all the little scratched into the muzzles. You can see these doors outside this Casemate Museum. So you can see how this would be officer housing, right? You could go into your individual quarters here. They very much could quarter it up and have access to it. So I can see how this could be, redesigned for officer housing or for the Fort Monroe Club like we saw inside. On May 19th, 1865, the steamer William Clyde reached Old Point Comfort and anchored offshore. On board were 2 Confederate prisoners, Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederate States, and Clement Clay, a Confederate senator from Alabama. On May 22nd, the prisoners were brought ashore to Fort Monroe, and Davis was escorted here to Casemate number 2, which became his cell for the first 4.5 months of his 2-year confinement here at Fort Monroe. And then this is where the president of the Confederacy was confined. The flag hung in this cell while Jefferson Davis was prisoner. So they made a point. It was retained at the end of the war by Major Theodore Price. It has 35 stars because West Virginia became a state during the Civil War, so 35 stars, and this was hung in here. As it's displayed in its position, it would have been a constant and painful reminder to Jefferson Davis of his status as a prisoner of the government. So this is what Jefferson Davis looked like when he came here. He got very sick here. I think his wife was allowed to come here and nurse him back to health. And that's the marker of the confinement of Jefferson Davis. So it's a historic marker that's kind of on the outside. We were inside, we got to see what the cell was like. But again, May 22nd to October 2nd of 1865, his health suffered here. He remained here from October 1865 until May 1867, so 2 years. 3 charges were brought against him. First charge, the assassination of the president. Second charge, treason, and the third charge, mistreatment of Union prisoners. So those were the 3 charges that Jefferson Davis was held here for. There were conflicting opinions in America. Some people felt imprisonment was too harsh of a punishment, wanting his release, wanting that healing. Other people felt like it wasn't harsh enough and he should be executed. This talks about his release from prison. On May 11th, 1867, Jefferson Davis walked out of Fort Monroe. His release from Fort Monroe started this legal maneuverings, and in 2 years, all charges were dropped. He never again regained his U.S. citizenship. He refused to apply for a pardon, and many years after his death in 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the act of Congress finally restoring his citizenship. So you can blame Carter for that. So another big part of this Casemate Museum is going to be the artillery, right? The cannons, and going into a lot of conversation about just the technology, cannon technology, discovering these cannons. A lot of them were found in the moat right out here. And these openings are just big enough for the cannon. Remember, these casemates, 5'7", says caution, watch your head. I just barely make it. I can barely. The casemates have these arches because it has so much strength. It can bear its own weight, it's not able to shift. It's an ancient architectural principle to have an arch. So as you walk around, you notice the arch of the bricktops of each casemate. And then these are just artillery implements. These are things that are used to load the cannons, clean the cannons, put the spark in, put the wick in, especially when it's hot. So one of the famous people who were here at Fort Monroe is Edgar Allan Poe. On May 26, 1827, he enlisted in the U.S. Army under the alias Edgar A. Perry, and he was stationed at Fort Monroe with the 1st Regiment Artillery. December 15, 1828, April 14, 1829. So he was here a couple months. He achieved the rank of Sergeant Major. He didn't finish his military service. Do you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe? He was discharged before he finished his service, but he was here at Fort Monroe. So on Walk with History, we talk a lot about Ichabod Crane, right? I talked about Ichabod Crane, Charles Crane at Arlington. I talked about Ichabod Crane in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But the actual Ichabod Crane led a battalion organized at Fort Monroe during the Black Hawk War, and he later served as the fort's post commander, 1842, and then 1853 to 1855. This is the actual Ichabod Crane. This is a very good depiction of what happened here at Fort Monroe during the Civil War. Fort Monroe never fell to the Confederacy, so 15 days after the Contraband decision, which is basically you could leave, as an enslaved person, you could leave your plantation and come north to where it was Union held. A slave boat out of Richmond, Virginia, manumitting 30 slaves into Fortress Monroe at the presence of General Butler, who refused to give them up unless the owner took oath of allegiance to the federal government. So enslaved who had run away, Butler didn't know what to do, General Butler's decision, and he received approval from President Lincoln, was his contraband decision. Basically, you had to, if you stayed with the Confederacy, you gave up your enslaved to the Union. They were contraband. They were now belonged to the Union. And that's what happened in May 29th, 1861. So enslaved would come here to Fort Monroe. This is really great depictions of the Ironclads. So we have a whole video about the Ironclad battle here of the Civil War. It takes place more close to Fort Norfolk, but here's the Monitor that actually sunk off the coast of Hatteras. And we also have a video off the coast of Hatteras that talks about the Monitor and where it sunk, and then the Virginia, the Merrimack. So these are the two ironclads that had the battle against each other. So here's the end of the museum. You get to more rooms that haven't been updated for a long time. You got fans in here because of the humidity, but you can see what the actual brick looks like, the actual cannons look like in the windows, just how old all this brick really is, what these actually look like. And these were all open, right? So these forts, I mean, this is around the entire fort. These openings, these casemates, basically. This is the end of the museum, so I hope you really enjoyed looking at that. It's a really cool place to visit, and it's free, so it's here for you. On to my next Walk with History.